We're always like trying to figure things out,
Yeah.
right? Trying to like find some kind of truth about the world.
Yeah, Benny.
And it's so interesting to see how different people approach that whole like search for truth.
Totally. Yeah.
And today we're looking at this story about these two friends, Siddhartha and Govinda,
Okay.
and it's about the different paths they take after meeting the Buddha.
Exactly. And I think what we've been looking at in these excerpts from this text is specifically a chapter called Gotama.
Right.
And it really gets into like what it means to seek enlightenment,
Yeah.
how we kind of grapple with teachings and wisdom.
Yeah. And the source material kind of sets it up so well. Like they're both, Siddhartha and Govinda are both on this spiritual quest,
Right.
and they just happen to come across the Buddha and his whole community.
Yeah.
But like right away, they react so differently.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the jumping off point for our deep dive today.
Absolutely. So for you, the listener, kind of what we want to do in this deep dive is really explore those key moments in Siddhartha's encounter with the Buddha.
Right.
We want to understand why he ultimately decides not to like directly follow the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah.
And like the significant insights that he gains about truth and like finding your own way.
Yes.
So think of it as like a way to reflect on your own journey of understanding.
Okay, let's get into it. One of the first things that stood out to me was the whole observation that these holy men, these followers of the Buddha, were begging for a living.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't know, in our modern context, that's kind of like an eyebrow raiser, right?
It is, yeah. And I think that this is where it becomes really important to understand the cultural context.
Totally.
Think of it like Houston Smith's point.
Okay.
These seekers aren't trying to become like economically independent. Their goal is to be independent of economics.
So it's less about like being poor and more about intentionally detaching from the need for material possessions.
And-
So like it frees them up to really focus on the spiritual side of things.
Right. It signifies a commitment to a different kind of wealth,
Yeah.
spiritual wealth.
Yeah.
And I think it also highlights the interconnectedness within the community where giving and receiving support each other.
Now, there's this moment that like really grabbed me, and it's how Siddhartha immediately recognizes the Buddha,
Yeah.
but Govinda doesn't, at least not at first.
Right.
And it's like, was Siddhartha just like tapping into something deeper, like an intuition?
That's a fascinating question. And while the text doesn't explicitly say it was pure intuition, it does suggest another kind of factor at play, and that's something called kinesics.
Kinesics.
Kinesics, yeah. Essentially, it's the study of body language.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. Can you unpack that a little? Like how body language might have been a factor here?
For sure. So the text really meticulously describes how Siddhartha perceived the Buddha physically right. Like his face was calm, he had this quiet inner smile, his gestures were peaceful, conveying a deep sense of stillness and authenticity, devoid of searching or imitation, as the text puts it.
Wow. So he was just like completely comfortable with himself
Yes,
and like radiating peace.
exactly.
So Siddhartha is picking up on these like nonverbal signals, right? This genuine presence that
Yeah.
just sets this guy apart.
Yeah, it's like he's reading a different kind of language.
Totally. And then you contrast that with Govinda.
Right.
Govinda just sees another monk in the familiar yellow robes.
Right, because another monk.
Nothing to distinguish him from like any of the others.
Yeah, it's only when Siddhartha points out this is the Buddha
Oh, wow.
that Govinda also kind of perceives it.
And so this leads to Govinda making a pretty big decision.
Yeah.
He decides to join the Buddhist community to
Right.
seek guidance in his teachings. And the text even kind of hints that maybe Govinda felt that he could finally like lead Siddhartha by embracing this seemingly like clear path.
That's a really insightful observation, and I think it's important to consider that Govinda had always been the devoted companion,
Hmm.
the one always walking one step behind,
Right.
as Siddhartha himself notes later on. And so, embracing this seemingly well-defined path of the Buddha's teachings could have been Govinda's opportunity to assert his own conviction and perhaps even feel like he was taking the lead for the first time.
Yeah. And what about Siddhartha's response to all this?
Yeah.
I mean, he seems outwardly supportive, wishing Govinda well, but there's also this underlying sense of detachment.
Yeah.
He even mentions Govinda's tendency to follow and expresses this hope that his friend will finally choose his own way independently.
Yeah, I think this moment really highlights a core difference in their fundamental approaches to seeking.
Totally.
Govinda's looking for a guide and a structured path,
Right.
whereas Siddhartha, even at this early stage, seems to place a higher value on individual exploration and discovery.
And then Siddhartha reflects on what he sees as these like necessary renunciations to truly follow the Buddha.
Right.
He lists all these things like leaving home, parents, birth, identity, possessions, free will, even friendship.
Wow.
It's a pretty big list of sacrifices.
It is. And from a psychological perspective, these kinds of renunciations can be understood as a way to dismantle the ego and the attachments that are believed to be the root of suffering
Right.
in this particular spiritual framework.
Right.
So by letting go of these connections and identities, the seeker aims to dissolve the sense of a separate individual self and ultimately attain liberation.
It's like stripping away all the layers of identity that we build through life to create a clean slate, to like fully absorb and commit to the teachings.
Exactly.
But then we come to the statement from Siddhartha to Govinda, and he says, "Very good are the teachings of the Exalted One. How could I find a fault in them?" I don't know. It feels a bit like, is he being completely sincere here?
That's a really key question for understanding Siddhartha's internal struggle. While he verbally acknowledges the apparent value of the teachings, there is a strong undercurrent of doubt and reservation.
Right.
And his subsequent dialogue with the Buddha himself makes it clear that he does, in fact, have a fundamental disagreement,
Right.
which we'll explore further.
Okay, so was this more of Siddhartha's way of being polite
Possibly.
and acknowledging the teachings without, like, fully endorsing them?
It's possible it served both purposes.
Yeah.
It allowed him to maintain his connection with Govinda in that moment
Right.
while still holding on to his own growing reservations.
Yeah. And do you think his words might have, like, influenced Govinda's decision to stay?
It's certainly plausible that Siddhartha's seemingly positive affirmation reinforced Govinda's choice
Yeah.
and made him feel more confident in his decision.
This brings us to the heart of Siddhartha's intellectual conflict with the Buddha.
Okay.
This seeming contradiction he sees in the doctrine of causality.
Okay.
Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely.
Yep.
So Siddhartha understands the Buddha's teachings on causality to mean that everything in the universe is interconnected
Okay.
in an unbroken chain of cause and effect.
Got it.
Nothing happens randomly or because of divine intervention.
Right.
It's a very consistent deterministic view of reality.
Okay.
Think of it like a giant row of dominoes, where each falling domino inevitably causes the next one to fall.
Okay, so everything's connected. One thing leads to another.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's the puzzle that Siddhartha grapples with.
Okay.
If everything, including our thoughts and decisions,
Yeah.
is already determined by this chain of cause and effect, then how could we truly choose to follow the Buddha's path and attain salvation?
Yeah, where does free will fit into all of this?
Exactly right. Like if our decision to follow the teachings is just another falling domino,
Right.
is it really a choice at all?
So it's like we're just going through the motions.
Exactly. And Siddhartha raises the question of whether the Buddha might be subtly guiding his disciples, even if it seems to contradict the strict principle of causality.
Right. So it's like, is there a degree of skillful guidance happening, even if it creates a logical tension?
Precisely. And this tension leads Siddhartha to observe what appears to be a distinction in the Buddha's approach between seeking salvation and seeking knowledge.
Yeah, and the text even mentions these unprofitable questions that the Buddha seems to avoid.
Yes.
What are those all about?
So the Buddha, as he illustrates with the powerful analogy of the poisoned arrow, prioritizes the urgent need to alleviate suffering above getting caught up in abstract philosophical debates about the nature of the universe. The self, what happens after death.
Yeah.
Imagine someone has been shot with a poisoned arrow.
Okay.
The immediate priority is to remove the arrow and treat the wound, not to debate who shot it, what kind of feathers are on the arrow, where it came from.
So he's not necessarily dismissing knowledge,
Right.
but he's saying some questions are a distraction from the immediate task of ending suffering.
Precisely.
It's about direct experience and inner transformation,
Yeah.
not just intellectual understanding,
Exactly.
at least as the primary focus.
And this brings up an interesting point.
Okay.
In this context, is intuition necessarily irrational?
Hmm.
The Buddha's emphasis on personal experience and inner realization could be seen as valuing a different kind of knowing,
Okay.
one that goes beyond purely logical or intellectual comprehension.
Interesting.
It's about a direct knowing, a feeling of truth.
Which takes us back to this whole idea of free will in a deterministic world. You know, this is something that Siddhartha is really wrestling with, and it still feels so relevant today.
Yeah.
If everything is just cause and effect, are we really in control of our actions? Do we truly have choices?
That's one of the most enduring debates in philosophy.
Yeah.
If the universe operates according to strict causal laws,
Right.
then every event, including our decisions,
Yeah.
is theoretically predictable given all the preceding causes.
Right.
This leaves very little room for the traditional idea of free will as the genuine ability to have acted differently
Right.
in the exact same circumstances.
And the alternative is this indeterministic world where things can just happen randomly without cause.
Right.
I mean, that also feels a little unsettling.
It does. And
Right.
as the text touches on, in such a scenario, could we even truly choose not to choose?
Yeah, it's a mind-bending thought.
It is.
If there's genuine randomness, then even the decision to abstain from choosing
Right.
could be seen as just another random event
Yeah,
rather than like a deliberate act of free will.
exactly. It really highlights how complex the concept of choice is.
So if we accept this idea of a strictly causal universe,
Hmm.
what implications does that have for how we think about making good and bad choices?
Hmm.
If our actions are ultimately just the result of prior causes, how can we meaningfully judge them?
This is where ethics gets very complicated in a deterministic framework.
Yeah.
If our choices couldn't have been otherwise, then concepts like blame and praise, reward and punishment become difficult to justify in a traditional sense.
Totally.
Some might argue that these concepts still serve a purpose in shaping future behavior,
Right.
but their underlying philosophical basis is definitely challenged.
And then there's this really powerful statement in the text where Siddhartha realizes that the Buddha has given me Siddhartha myself.
Right.
What do you think he means by that?
It's a powerful statement of self-discovery.
Yeah.
By engaging deeply with the Buddha's teachings and ultimately choosing his own independent path,
Right.
Siddhartha has paradoxically been liberated from the potential of simply becoming a follower, an echo of someone else's wisdom.
Yeah.
He's been compelled to confront his own being and forge his own unique understanding.
So even though Siddhartha doesn't become a direct disciple of the Buddha, it's
Yeah.
like this interaction sparks his own journey of self-realization.
Yeah.
Do you think that might have been an unintended or even intended outcome of their meeting?
It's difficult to know the Buddha's specific intentions.
Yeah.
However, his parting words to Siddhartha, "Be aware of too much wisdom,"
Right.
could be interpreted as a subtle encouragement for Siddhartha to move beyond purely intellectual understanding
Yeah.
and to find his own truth through personal experience.
And that connects really well with Siddhartha's vow to never lower his glance before another man after this encounter.
Hmm.
It seemed like a pretty strong reaction to just one meeting.
It does seem like a very firm resolution stemming from a single encounter.
Yeah.
However, I think it's important to remember that Siddhartha's meeting with the Buddha wasn't just any interaction.
Yeah.
He recognized a profound level of truth and holiness in the Buddha, someone who seemed to have attained the very things that Siddhartha was seeking.
Right.
In that moment, he encountered someone worthy of the deepest respect.
Yeah.
Perhaps his vow is less about arrogance and more about holding on to that standard, refusing to be swayed by lesser authorities or incomplete understandings. It's about maintaining a sense of his own worth and the seriousness of his quest.
And those final words from the Buddha to Siddhartha, be aware of too much wisdom. It's such a concise but thought-provoking statement.
It is.
What's your take on that? What do you think he meant?
Given Siddhartha's sharp intellect and his tendency to analyze and question everything,
Yeah.
the Buddha's warning could be seen as a reminder that intellectual understanding alone isn't sufficient.
Right.
True wisdom, especially on the path to enlightenment, often requires intuition, direct experience,
Right.
and a willingness to go beyond the limitations of purely rational thought.
Right.
It's a caution against getting lost in intellectual complexities and missing the deeper experiential aspects of understanding.
So to kind of sum it all up, our deep dive into this chapter reveals Siddhartha's recognition of the Buddha's holiness,
Yes.
but also his engagement with the teachings and ultimate disagreement,
Right.
particularly around this concept of causality
Yeah.
and what it means for free will.
Absolutely. And we see his identification of this apparent contradiction
Right.
and his subsequent decision to leave the Buddhist community.
Right. And it's not like he's rejecting the Buddha himself or anything,
Right.
but it's this commitment to his own unique and independent journey of self-discovery.
Exactly. It underscores the fundamental tension between seeking knowledge through established doctrines
Right.
and pursuing personal realization beyond them, a dynamic that resonates deeply with the complexities of any quest for understanding.
So for you, the listener, here's a final thought to kind of chew on.
Okay.
Can true understanding, especially of like these profound truths about ourselves and the world, ever be fully given to us through external teachings?
Hmm.
Or is a personal, maybe even solitary journey of exploration ultimately essential for achieving genuine and lasting insight?
Hmm.
Think about the balance in your own life between learning from the wisdom of others
Yeah,
and cultivating your own inner knowing.
that's a great point to leave on.
It's a deep dive that hopefully leaves you with some intriguing questions to think about on your own path.